Big Apple Blitz with Anthony Rivardo and Matt O'Leary.
Hello and welcome into episode 1 of Big Apple Blitz. What is going on? I am Matt O'Leary, joined by my co-host Anthony Rivardo. Anthony, how are you doing today?
Doing great, man. I'm excited to start this new channel, kind of dip my toes into discussing the New York Jets a little bit, provide some good insights on my New York Giants, and really just get ready for free agency because it's shaping up to be a pretty interesting NFL offseason.
Absolutely. It's NFL offseason time, which unfortunately for the last few years seems to be when the Jets and Giants shine the most, the offseason, talking free agency and the NFL draft. And, you know, figure what better way than combining a Jets and Giants perspective to do a little New York football talk. So I am excited to get it going. And I think you said it perfect. The free agency is going to be the big focus right now. And I think we start episode 1 by going back and forth on some free agent targets for both sides and, you know, get it going, interact with the chat and just see how we go in episode 1. I'm excited.
Yeah, me too. I'm ready to dive in.
Perfect. All right. So let's start with, we'll start with your Giants. We'll kind of just go back and forth on different, you know, potential targets. What's a name for you that's jumping out for the Giants as a potential free agent target that ranks pretty high up on your list?
Yeah, one guy that stands out for me is Sean Murphy-Bunting from the Tennessee Titans. Obvious connection there with our newly hired defensive coordinator, Shane Bowen. We hired him. He was the former DC for the Titans over the last 3 seasons. Sean Murphy-Bunting spent this past season with the Titans and had a pretty decent year. And now that the Giants are moving into this new defense with Wink Martindale leaving, there should be a lot of transitioning going from a 3-4 front to a little bit of a multiple front, 3-4-4-3, nickel heavy defense. They need more defensive backs in this defensive scheme than they needed in the Wink Martindale system. So bringing in a guy like Sean Murphy-Bunting, who's got familiarity with the scheme and with the coaching staff, I think that's kind of a low cost, low risk, high reward type move. He's had some really good seasons in the past. I mean, maybe he's not the CB1 that the Giants fans might be looking for, but in terms of quality, kind of bargain bin shopping free agents, I think he perfectly fits the mold with what the New York Giants are looking for.
Yeah, and that's the thing too, right? Like in free agency, you can't always go like each position by position and say, all right, you want the best in each group. Like that's just not the reality of how, you know, that's most likely to pan out here for any team, not just Giants. And with Sean Murphy-Bunting, as you mentioned, it has the connection with a new coach in here. Where do you see him fitting in? Because I know earlier in his career he was more of a slot corner, and this past year he played a little bit on the outside, but it didn't seem like he did as well when he transitioned to playing on the outside.
Yeah, I think that the Giants slot cornerback position is kind of up for debate. A lot of fans feel like Cordell Flott has won that starting job. Other fans feel like it's still open for competition. I feel like it's still open for competition. So for Sean Murphy-Bunting, when you're looking at this Giants secondary, you know your CB1 is Deonte Banks. You're expecting him to take a big step forward in year 2. But opposite him, you need something better than what we had this past season with Adoree Jackson. He was constantly struggling. Kind of looks like he's aged out of the role of a primary starting cornerback. And with him likely leaving in free agency, it leaves a big hole at that CB2 spot on the boundary. And I think that's probably where Sean Murphy-Bunting would fill in. But if they do go into the draft and take a cornerback, then you have Sean Murphy-Bunting and you can just slide him into the slot. So I think his versatility and his ability to play both of those spots is important and would probably add to the Giants' likelihood of signing him. Brian Daboll always says you got to be smart, tough, dependable, says he needs versatility, positional versatility in the secondary is important for him. So when you're looking at that kind of factor with Sean Murphy-Bunting, again, it just makes him that perfect target for the Giants in free agency.
No, absolutely. And something else that I think you have to like with, he's a veteran, right? He has 5 years experience in league and he's still only, 26 years old. He'll be 27 in June. So it's not like, you're paying a guy in the secondary who's about to be 30. As we know, it's, it's a position where guys usually tend to slow down a little bit at 30 years old. And I would imagine going back with a former coach could make him a bounce back candidate as well, even though he wasn't spectacular in Tennessee. I mean, that Titans team wasn't really much to write home about anyway, especially defensively.
I think that's 100% right. He just looks like one of those players. You said it best there. Not super old like a Dory Jackson who's in his 30s. So it's not something to be concerned about with his age. And then in terms of bounce back candidates, I think it was just kind of year one in a system with him with Shane Bowen. And if you like Shane Bowen liked him. I think that they should continue to build together in year two and see how it goes here with the New York Giants.
Absolutely. So for the first one that I'm going to bring up for the Jets side of things, is offensive line, because I think that's obviously a position of need probably for both these teams. We might get into some names here, but I want to bring up Jermaine Illuminor from the Las Vegas Raiders as a potential target for the Jets, because they are going into an offseason where they're probably losing both of their day one starting tackles from last year, and Dwayne Brown and Mekhi Becton. Both are free agents and both unlikely to come back to the Jets. And you have Elijah Vera Tucker, who has the positional flexibility, who could play either on the at the guard spot or at the tackle spot, has flexibility on either the left side or the right side of the offensive line, which I think is obviously a plus. But with someone like Illuminor, he has that guard and tackle flexibility, which again, I think is just a plus. A lot of these coaches, they tend to seem to look for guys who can play, multiple positions. And I think he would be someone a little bit on the cheaper end. Like you see a lot of these names like Trent Williams, or Jonah Williams, excuse me, or Trent Brown, who are probably going to get $15+ million a year AAV in free agency. And someone like Illuminor, I think, could fill in at right tackle and probably be closer in that $8 to $10 million a year range. And I'm not sure there's really as much of a drop off as some might expect. Like obviously Brown and Williams have the name recognition a little bit more than a guy like Illuminor. But again, I don't necessarily buy that there's this huge drop off between the two.
I don't think there is, and I actually think Jermaine Illuminor is a perfect fit for the New York Giants as well. I think he makes sense for both of these teams, but I'll speak to him on the Giants side of things. Recently hired a new offensive line coach, Carmen Bricolo, from the Las Vegas Raiders, and during their time together in Las Vegas, Jermaine Illuminor took a huge step forward under Bricolo, seemed to really take to his coaching. So now with the Giants and their new offensive line coach having this connection, I always think coaching staff connections really dictate what a team is going to do in free agency, especially when they're bringing in new coaches. So that's why I brought up Sean Murphy-Bunting for Shane Bowen, and that's why I think Jermaine Illuminor for Carmen Bricolo makes so much sense. And another player that Jets fans are familiar with, Greg Van Roten, also was with the Raiders this past season, had maybe his best season of his career this past year with the Las Vegas Raiders. I think that he's another player that the Giants are going to look at, recognize there's some familiarity there with Carmen Bricolo, their new offensive line coach, and think either one of those guys or even both of those guys, Jermaine Illuminor and Van Roten, since they're both kind of on the lower end of the market value, I think that they're perfect fits for the Giants just to combine them with their new offensive line coach and create some continuity up front.
Yeah, and GVR is a name that Jet fans are very familiar with. Spent the 2020 and 2021 season with the New York Jets at right guard. Was a frustrating player on the Jet side of things. As you mentioned, though, obviously coming off a career year, and when you're bringing over the offensive line coach that he had the most success with, that is something that is appealing when you're bargain bin shopping. From the Jet side with Greg Van Roten, I think he'll be remembered for rolling up on Mekhi Becton and ending his 2021 season, which unfortunately is not great. But for just going to Illuminor for a second, as on the Jets side, as I mentioned, like you could make a case that they could go either guard or tackle in free agency. It's going to really be contingent on where they want to play Elijah Vera Tucker. If they want to play him at guard, then you're probably in a spot where you're going to have to sign a tackle in free agency and then draft one in the first round. And if you're comfortable playing with him at tackle, then it's probably more likely to see them add on the interior And, you have someone like Laken Tomlinson who you could cut and free up some money, or you could, there's been a big debate amongst Jets fans what they do in that boat. From Illuminor, that seems like a target that I would be, comfortable with, because again, not necessarily in that same $15+ million a year range. From the Jets side, I personally want no part of Greg Van Roten, just because they've kind of been down that road. And you're not getting the luxury of going with that coach that he's had the most success with. But totally makes sense from the Giants end why they could potentially look at Van Roten as a name.
Yeah, that's really the only draw for me. I think that a few Giants fans I've seen have thrown out the name of Greg Van Roten, and I'm like, okay, I know his PFF grades this past season may have looked nice, but if you're looking at the entirety of his career, and if you kind of go through what Jets fans have said about him in the past, he's not a player to get really excited about, even though Giants fans seem to be getting excited about him. But again, he did have a career year this past season with Las Vegas. You're seeing it there at the PFF stats. He fills a need for the Giants at right guard, and I don't necessarily think that the New York Giants need to go into free agency and break the bank for one of the top offensive guards in the NFL. They have such a bad group of offensive linemen that getting somebody in who's just about average is going to look like a Hall of Famer for the New York Giants. I keep saying that. So Greg Van Roten coming in here, he's better than what we have. He's going to play and perform at a higher level than any of the New York Giants offensive linemen were last season. It's hard to get any worse than things were for the Giants offensive line last year. So Greg Van Roten, again, maybe not one of those players that is a long-term solution or really creates some significant upgrade for most offensive lines, but for the Giants offensive line, to get a guy like Van Roten in there who's maybe slightly below average to average, that's a big upgrade over being one of the worst offensive linemen in the NFL. So I think that he makes a lot of sense on what's probably going to be a very cheap 1-year deal for the Giants.
Now, let me ask you this from the Giants' perspective on things, because I've known that, or I've heard rather, that they seem like they might want to move Evan Neal inside. Would that decision potentially impact targets in free agents? Like, even if they are planning to move him inside to guard, do you still think they're in the market for guard in free agency?
I still think they're in the market for guard because, firstly, left guard is a question mark and right guard is a question mark. They don't have a starter at either of those spots. So even if you move him into left or right guard, you've still got an opening at one of those two positions. And then furthermore, I'd say with Evan Neal, I don't know if they're going to make their decision on where he's playing until we get to training camp. And so they're probably going to attack this offseason without Evan Neal in mind and just know that he's available to play at one of these starting positions and kind of just upgrade wherever they can. He doesn't prevent you from drafting or signing a tackle, and he doesn't prevent you from drafting or signing a guard. You still have him, but you don't want to kind of put your hopes into him and make anything contingent on him this season. So I think the Giants are going to upgrade at guard, upgrade at tackle, still have Evan Neal, and if he's playing well in training camp at any of those spots, he'll get a starting job, because you still want to believe in a guy that you took 7th overall in 2022. But he doesn't prevent you from upgrading this team in any way, I don't think, just because he hasn't proven to be good enough to perform at a starting level yet.
No, absolutely. And slightly different because they were a year apart at this time when these conversations were happening, but it almost feels like you can make that comparison with Evan Neal to what the Jets were going into this season with Mekhi Becton. It was kind of like, this is a first round pick who, like, there's no trade value on him. So you're almost better off just riding it out and seeing, if you get anything out of him, it's a plus, but it doesn't necessarily stop you from adding more talent to that line, because, obviously for both of these teams, it's, but in particular for the Giants in this case, still a massive need to improve that unit.
Yeah, I mean, whatever they can do to improve the unit on both of these teams, it's got to be their number one priority this offseason. Obviously, the Giants let up 85 sacks this past season, which was the most in the NFL and the most since 1990. So fixing the offensive line, if they don't do that, the season's just going to go into the tank once again.
Absolutely. Now, this next name here, Anthony, I think is a good one to get into, because this seems like a fit for both of these teams. We were texting before the show, and he's on the graphic, Mike Onwenu. Talk to me about why you think he's a great fit for this Giants team.
I think the number one thing is his versatility. He's been a starter at right guard. He's been a starter at right tackle, and he's done both of those at a very high level. And once again, I'm going to bring up a coaching staff connection. Carmen Bristolo, the new offensive line coach who I mentioned as a connection for the Raiders guys, also a connection for the Patriots guys because he was there as their offensive line coach in 2020. So he's coached Onwenu before. Onwenu had great success under Carmen Bristolo, played right guard, played right tackle under Bristolo, continue to do that at a high level with the New England Patriots. And it sounds like the Patriots are preparing for him to leave in free agency. It sounds like they don't feel they have a very solid chance of extending him. So if the Giants are going to make any kind of a splash this offseason, I would like it to be Onwenu. I think the familiarity is there with our offensive line coach, and I think the quality is there at right tackle or right guard, whichever one, because both of those are going to be open for the Giants. Evan Neal doesn't prevent you from signing an Onwenu, even though you invested the 7th pick in him at right tackle. Onwenu is going to be a significant upgrade at right tackle or right guard, whichever position you want him to play. So he makes the most sense for me for the New York Giants because you know that even if Evan Neal ends up being your starter at right tackle, you're signing a top tier guard. And if you don't want Evan Neal as your right tackle, then you're signing a top tier tackle. So it's just kind of like signing Onwenu. You're fixing one of two positions, if not both of them, by moving Evan Neal to guard and hopefully him improving his play there.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think a lot of the things you just mentioned is why he's a good fit for the Jets too, because they could potentially have either an opening at right tackle or at right guard, depending on what they want to do with Elijah Vera Tucker. And I love that he has the flexibility to play either of those two spots. His best year that he had was probably when he was playing right guard in 2022 with New England. Both those guys are really, both of those positions are ones that both these teams need to lock down in the Jets and the Giants. And, you know, for me Onwenu, another key point is something we talked about a little bit with Sean Murphy Bunting is his age. He just turned 26 in December. So it's not like you're paying a guy, for instance, Brown is a free agent from the New England Patriots. He's already over 30 years old, where Onwenu's 26. He's just entering his prime now. If you're going to pony up and pay someone in free agency, I don't know about you, but I always feel a little bit more comfortable going with the younger guy who's coming off their rookie deal than a guy who's already gotten paid, you know, is over 30 years old and maybe not the best for the long term for a team.
Yeah, 100%. I think Onwenu not only has that experience and has been a starter for several seasons, but like you said, he is young enough to be a long-term solution for the New York Giants or the New York Jets on their offensive line and at one of two positions. It's very rare that you find an offensive lineman hitting the open market that can fill more than one position on the offensive line and do both at a high level. Very rare opportunity for both the Jets and the Giants, and I think that we could see a bidding war between the two teams for Onwenu this offseason.
Yeah, absolutely. And it feels like maybe earlier on in the I know we're early in the offseason, free agency really hasn't hit yet, but like when the regular season came to a close, it felt like Onwenu wasn't really a name that was getting talked about as much as some of the other guys who are hitting the market. But now I feel like a lot more people are starting to recognize his talent and his his price point is going up. Where do you think he ends up range wise in getting paid?
I think it's a tough question, but if I had to guess, I don't think he tops 20 million, but he probably pushes close to it. 16 to 18 million is probably what you're going to be looking at for Onwenu. So this isn't going to be, a cheap option. Jermaine Illuminor would be your cheap solution at right tackle if that's the way you want to go. But if you want to make a splash in free agency and shop at the top of the market, Onwenu is probably going to push close to that 20 million, but not reach it, in my opinion.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. It seemed like, again, like people weren't as high on him, and I've seen some projected contracts that were much lower, but I think he's going to end up getting into that Brown, Williams, Tyron Smith, AAV wise on a deal. But because of his age and his availability, some of these other guys have injury history. Onwenu's probably my favorite tackle option on the market. Do you feel the same way, or is this just more of the connection to the new offensive line coach for the Giants?
No, I feel the same way. I think when you're looking at the tackles available this offseason, a lot of them have big question marks. I don't feel that way with Mike Onwenu. I think, especially once you get past Onwenu and you start looking at guys like Jonah Williams, which position is he going to play, left tackle or right tackle? He's had injuries in the past. Illuminor, again, is a solid talent, but not, maybe a massive upgrade for most teams. Josh Jones, once you get further down the list, Donovan Smith, there's not a ton of talent available in this tackle group. And Onwenu really stands out as being a younger talent and a high quality talent.
Yeah, absolutely. And for me, another name that I wanted to bring up from the Jets side of things, they desperately need another wide receiver to add to this group to get with Garrett Wilson. Garrett Wilson's a clear-cut number one receiver, but beyond that, there's some major question marks, and they could potentially do it in the draft. But without a second-round pick due to the Aaron Rodgers trade and the need on the offensive line, I think free agency and or a trade is going to be an avenue that the Jets are going to need to pursue at the wide receiver spot. Now, wide receiver market and free agency, I think, is going to be a little bit interesting. Like, there's some bigger names that could potentially be there. Like, T. Higgins is apparently going to get tagged, so that's one off the list. Michael Pittman's another name who I don't know if he reaches the market. Mike Evans, kind of a similar thing, but I think Calvin Ridley's an interesting name for someone who has a pretty good chance to hit the market here. In his first year with Jacksonville, had a solid bounce back season after missing most of 2022. Had over 1,000 yards and 8 touchdowns. 2 years ago. He served the suspension in 22. In 2021, only 281 yards and 2 touchdowns. But to me, this seems like a guy who is maybe a little bit more realistic to hit the open market as compared to some of the other bigger names, and I think would complement the skill set of Garrett Wilson in this wide receiver room.
Yeah, I think that if you want to look at it from the Giants' perspective, Calvin Ridley probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because what the Giants really need is a bona fide WR1. And Calvin Ridley, I question whether or not he is that at this point, but combining him with a player like a Garrett Wilson, that makes the most sense to me. And I think realistically, he will be available in free agency. It's kind of tough because I know that the Jacksonville Jaguars invested quite a bit when they traded for him, so they might feel hesitant to let an investment like that hit the open market. But if he does, makes a lot of sense for the New York Jets. For the Giants, I think that there's other names out there that probably make more sense. I think the Giants are going to have to go cheap in free agency at the wide receiver position. They're not in a position to go out there and spend big. You also mentioned Mike Evans. I wrote about him today for the New York Giants perspective. That's, again, a player that probably doesn't make sense because he's going to be seeking $25 million per season, most likely. But the recent report from Bleacher Report this morning was that he's likely to hit free agency now because they didn't get a deal done by today. They had a deadline in place with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, which was this morning. So I think for the New York Jets, Mike Evans should be their primary target. I know that a few Jets players have been campaigning for him on Twitter and kind of doing some of those things as recruitment tactics, which I find pretty interesting. But with Mike Evans, if he does hit the open market, that's like the number one piece that the New York Jets need, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, Mike Evans is just so steady and one of the more underrated guys of this, past era here. Just puts up 1,000 yards in his sleep every year. It doesn't really matter what the quarterback play is like. He did it with Baker Mayfield, obviously with Tom Brady, Jameis Winston. Like, no matter what the circumstances were, number one, he's putting up big numbers, and something that is really key for both sides, for both teams, the Jets and the Giants, rather. He plays a lot. Injuries aren't really a part of his game. Both these teams have kind of been decimated by injuries over the last couple of years. If he does hit the market, I'm curious to see how much money he would he would get. $25 million. It seems to be a fair price for him. I don't know if the Jets would be able to go up that high. I think Ridley would probably come in maybe somewhere around like 18 million. And if that $7 million difference, let's say, just using that as an example, that might allow them to add more depth on the offensive line, which to me is really not the only two things I care about in free agency, but a lot of it is kind of just retain as much as you can from the defense and special teams. That's fine. And just add talent in the wide receiver room and on the offensive line. So I would love Mike Evans. I question how likely it would be for him to sign here with the Jets cap situation.
Yeah, and I'm not totally familiar with the New York Jets cap situation, but I know for the Giants, signing any of those high-profile guys is going to be super difficult just because of that Daniel Jones contract, which is going to be the biggest hurdle to jump for the New York Giants all offseason, whether you're talking about in free agency, trying to sign any players to long-term deals, or if you're talking about the draft, how does it dictate your move in the first round versus the second round? The Daniel Jones contract just stands out like a sore thumb. It's ugly, and it's going to hold this team back this offseason. But thankfully, they can get out of it next offseason. So as long as they backload these deals, it shouldn't be too much of a problem. So if the Giants are to look at a player like a Mike Evans, again, it's going to be really difficult to get a guy like that under the salary cap this offseason. But if you backload the deal and you can lower that first year cap hit, once you cut Daniel Jones, you're pretty much home free. Not a whole lot of contracts signed long-term to this Giants team. So just using Mike Evans as a kind of example, but really talking about any of the top free agents that are going to be seeking that highest AAV on the market, it's doable for the Giants, but it's not going to be comfortable because of that Daniel Jones deal.
I like that. Yeah, that's going to be an interesting hurdle this year for the Giants, I think, anyway, when looking at just what they do in the first round. And I'm sure we'll have many episodes where we get into what, the draft and planning in the draft. There's different avenues that both these teams can go, and specifically with the Giants, with the debate between wide receiver and quarterback in the top 10. It's going to be really interesting. We got a cool question, I think, from our guy Tony in the chat. So I want to pull that up. He goes, you both have $15 million to sign 2 players. Who are you signing? So we'll do a Jets perspective on this one. So that's kind of, again, going the bargain bin route slightly here, right? If we're fitting 2 players under the $15 million, where are you going with this one?
One of them has to be Jermaine Illuminor for me, and I think that's why I've found it so funny that you brought him up from the Jets perspective, and he might even be on your list for this one. I think that he probably lands somewhere between 7 to 11 million. Maybe 10 is realistic, somewhere in that range. And then the other 5, that's going to Sean Murphy-Bunting for me, who we mentioned at the start of the show. Those 2 signings, I think, address 2 massive positions of need for the New York Giants, being right tackle and cornerback depth. And you're probably getting both of those guys for under $15 million. So those would be my two answers there for that question. Really good question.
Yeah, that is a really good question. It's interesting, right? Because you got to go on a little bit on the bargain bin area. I like Illuminor as well. I'm going to try to go in a different direction though, to give it just a little bit of a change up, but I'll go instead with a guard. I'll go with John Runyon. That's another little Aaron Rodgers Green Bay connection. So Runyon for maybe like $5 to $7 million, and then I'll use the other $8 to $10 million and go backup quarterback Jacoby Brissett will be signed, because that's also going to be a massive need for this team, for the Jets. Last year we saw them pretty much their season got derailed because they didn't have a good backup quarterback option. I don't think they make that same mistake twice. So I'll use my bargain bin shopping with a guard, have AVT out at tackle, and then sign a backup quarterback.
Yeah, the backup quarterback pick was nice. I hadn't really even thought about that, but that's something that both teams need to address. Obviously the Jets put on full display the value of a backup quarterback this past season, or rather the detriment of not having one. And the New York Giants kind of struggled with that as well. Obviously, Tommy DeVito stepped in, did his thing for a few weeks. Tyrod Taylor is a solid backup, but it doesn't sound like he's coming back. And all the reports that we're hearing is that the Giants are intent on bringing in a backup quarterback that's more than just a career backup this offseason, was the report in the New York Post. So it looks like they're going to try and sign a guy that they feel comfortable putting out there as the starter if they have to for an extended period of time, whether they're thinking that's just because Daniel Jones is injured and they're not sure when he's going to be ready, or they don't trust Daniel Jones to start all 17 games because he gets injured so often and because he's not that good. They're going to have to find a backup quarterback that's capable of starting a lot of games. So some of the names that I've looked at, Jacoby Brissett was a good one that you brought up. Gardner Minshew, if the Giants really do want to spend a little bit higher, I think he's going to be one of those more expensive backups because he can start you 17 games, as he did this past season with the Indianapolis Colts, was their starter the whole year round. But backup quarterback is definitely going to be a priority for both of these teams.
Yeah, for sure. It's going to be interesting to see the direction that both of these teams go at that spot. The value of backup quarterback, someone like Gardner, curious to see if he stays in Indianapolis and just backs up Richardson, which, that was probably his intended role this year before injuries ended up taking over for Anthony Richardson. I'm a big fan of Tyrod Taylor as like a backup quarterback option. He's had some starting experience in Buffalo. The Jets played him a few times. He's played the Jets pretty tough. Injuries though with him is a slight concern. It feels like he gets banged up often.
Yeah, injuries are always going to be the concern at the quarterback position. I mean, that's why you got to invest into a nice backup. Tyrod Taylor, though, I will say, if you're looking at him from the Jets' perspective, you're probably not getting more than 5 games from him without him getting hurt. So I don't think that for a team like the Jets that saw how badly you needed stability behind your starting quarterback, Tyrod Taylor wouldn't be somebody that I would target.
No. Are there any other free agent names that you wanted to bring up from the Giants side of things before we get into our next topic here?
I think that just generally speaking, the interior defensive line needs a couple more upgrades, I would say. I think that's something that Giants fans are maybe sleeping on. Bringing back Leonard Williams in free agency is kind of like the flashy and attractive option, but realistically, they're probably just going to bring in a few depth pieces. So don't have any specific names, but I wanted to touch on that and just kind of mention interior defensive line has to be a priority for them, not only because they had a severe lack of depth behind their starters this past season, but more so because they're transitioning to this new defensive front where they're going to be playing with more down linemen than they were last season. So adding more guys on the interior is now not going to be looked at as luxury signings. That's going to be priority signings. They have to bring in depth on the front seven.
Yeah, that's also a sneaky need for the Jets. And I think like if you're maybe not so entrenched in it as we are with these teams, you think like, okay, Dexter Lawrence, stud on the interior of the defensive line, Giants set there. Quinnen Williams, stud on the interior of the Jets defensive line, they're probably set there. But both teams could really use some extra depth there. And for instance, like on the Jets side of things, some free agents like Quentin Jefferson, who was playing well before he got hurt, he's a free agent. Big Al Woods, who they signed last year, late free agent. You also have Solomon Thomas, who had a really nice year for the Jets this year. He's a free agent. So suddenly, like, that's 3 guys who were a pretty big part of your rotation on the interior who you could potentially be losing. So none of those guys I really expect to get big deals. Like Leonard Williams is probably going to cash in and get another relatively big contract, where some of the guys that I just rattled off, probably more depth pieces. If Al Woods even does, come back, he might just retire after his Achilles injury. But moral of the story, I think both teams, Jets, Giants, can definitely be on the market looking for some depth interior pieces on the interior defensive line.
Yep, totally agreed.
So let's get into, I wanted to bring up this story, David Bakhtiari to New York Jets, because there was a report earlier this week that the Green Bay Packers could be looking to cut David Bakhtiari, which makes sense. He has a big cap hit. He's been injured. And naturally, because of Aaron Rodgers, there is going to be that connection of former Green Bay Packers or anyone who has been in the same room for more than 5 minutes with Aaron Rodgers. And Bakhtiari fits that mold. But for me, I understand, when there's no doubt when he's on the field and when he's playing, he's a very, very talented player and he plays at a very high level. But he's 33 years old, or will be 33 at the start of the year in September. And he's had 5 knee surgeries, with playing 1 game in 2023, 11 in 2022, 1 in 2021, and then 12 in 2020. He hasn't come close to playing a full season in each of the last 4 years. So I just don't see how the Jets, who were really derailed, like that. Another reason why this team derailed offensively, we mentioned backup quarterback, but another one is the offensive line was so bad and the number of injuries that they suffered on the line. How could you then go, all right, let's sign this guy who's consistently injured to try to fix that problem? It just doesn't make sense to me.
It doesn't make much sense to me either. This would have to be a contract that's very cheap. Like, he's taking a discount just to reunite with Aaron Rodgers, in my opinion. But this would be more so a leadership signing. And I'm never crazy about leadership signings. When teams go into free agency and they just bring in guys to serve as mentors or kind of serve as a buddy to another teammate that you brought in, I don't get behind that. I think that there's better ways to allocate the salary cap, and there's better ways to spend that money, and there's players who are more deserving and more dependable and more available than a David Bakhtiari, let's say. So for the Jets, it's going to be one of those storylines. Everybody's going to want to speculate around the potential reunion between Aaron Rodgers and David Bakhtiari, but just realistically, it's not the best option for them. They have to find other ways to upgrade their line.
Yeah, it's just, again, like you said, it's the Aaron Rodgers connection, and then number two, you're going to get the people, former All-Pro, is 4-time Pro Bowler. It would be good for whoever they draft at pick 10 to mentor, and you just all the cliche narratives that are going to get picked up. But at the same time, like, they're not in a spot where they could take a flyer on a guy who's coming off major injuries, and then something that both the Jets and the Giants deal with. How do you think that knee is going to hold up on the MetLife turf? That doesn't sound like a promising thing for me.
No, and I think that the MetLife turf has kind of been overblown in some ways. I'll say that the New York Giants only had one ACL tear in the entire season, and it happened in Las Vegas. It was Daniel Jones's ACL tear. The other one that they had prior to the season was a training camp body, and it happened on the practice field. So that's also a different case. But generally speaking, there are a lot of injuries at MetLife. Obviously, Jets fans know that, with Aaron Rodgers going down 5 snaps into the season. So David Bakhtiari, I think, just generally speaking, whether he's playing at MetLife or he's playing in Green Bay, the injuries are a concern. And this is a team that needs dependability. The Giants are the same way. They need guys who are available. Injuries have really plagued these teams for the past several years. Even the Giants bringing in a guy like Darren Waller last offseason. Lesson learned, don't bring in guys who have nagging career injuries. It just doesn't pan out here in New York for one reason or another. Anytime we bring in these guys who have this injury risk for one reason or another, that injury risk becomes that much greater. So for the Jets, for the Giants, any of these guys that just can't seem to stay healthy shouldn't really be on their list of targets this offseason.
No, that's such a key important factor that I don't think people really put much stock into. Again, they go with the name recognition. And sometimes that's another area that you don't want to look at, is the bigger names, and not just because of injury, but like sometimes there's a reason why these teams are moving on from them. Like Dalvin Cook last year, the Jets got bit by that one. Like there were clear signs that he was starting to take a step back after the 2022 season. And it was, here's a Pro Bowl running back who's hitting the market, even though he's, in his late 20s and has a ton of mileage on him, but he's a big name. So let's bring him in. And like, I don't know. I just don't really like that mindset. As you mentioned, sometimes it's just, the cliche, bringing the veteran who's been there and had big numbers. And it's just usually a recipe for disaster.
Yeah. And that's, again, like I mentioned with Darren Waller, they traded for him, 3rd-round pick, low cost, high reward, hopefully. But now we're seeing, after one season, he barely stayed on the field. He caught only 1 touchdown pass. And now the Giants are in a situation where if they cut Darren Waller, they free up $7 million, and that gets you a Jermaine Illuminor in free agency potentially, depending on how you structure that deal. So these injury risk guys, while they're flashy in some ways when you bring them in, again, with a guy like a Waller who's been a Pro Bowler in the past, you want to bring in those guys, but you're really bringing in a shell of those guys when the injuries pile up on a guy like a Bakhtiari. He's not David Bakhtiari anymore. Now he's kind of just a body that you put on your roster because you want him to be friends with Aaron Rodgers. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. And I think that the Jets need to learn their lesson here with how this past season went, investing too much into Aaron Rodgers. Yes, you have to invest in your quarterback position. You have to put the pieces around him, but there's plenty to be said about Hackett and putting too much into Aaron Rodgers, Lazard, all the investments that they made just to appease him and make Aaron Rodgers comfortable in New York. I think a lot of those investments came back to bite them this past season rather than benefit them. And so Bakhtiari would just be another one of those situations where you're bringing in a guy just for Aaron Rodgers, and maybe you should think twice about doing that.
Absolutely. And a couple good comments back to back from First State Jets talking about Pro Bowl. Says Mac Jones was a Pro Bowler, for crying out loud, and then follows it up with, I believe Mitch Trubisky was also in a Pro Bowl, which is which is true. So take those things with a grain of salt. The all pros, as always, are much more valuable than the Pro Bowl, which is more of a fan popularity contest.
That's really what it is. Wasn't Tyler Huntley in the Pro Bowl last year as well, I think.
Great call out. Great call out. So as always, take those ones with a grain of salt. Anything else you want to put out there before we wrap episode 1 of Big Apple Blitz here?
No, I mean, I just think that it's going to be an exciting offseason. Once we get into that draft discussion, I think it's going to be really exciting because what the Giants are going to do is very unknown. And then with the Jets, I think that the number one thing that they need to be careful, like I just mentioned here, talking about Bakhtiari, yeah, you have to invest in Aaron Rodgers and put those pieces around him, but they really need to be more careful with the way that they do it and not let him kind of LeBron James's team again. LeBron goes wherever he goes and he brings in all of his guys and he becomes the de facto GM. Aaron Rodgers did that last offseason. And again, I think it came back to bite them. And I think that Joe Douglas needs to take more of a hands-on approach here and not just kind of bend the knee to whatever Aaron Rodgers wants and needs. I think that he needs to construct this roster accordingly and get in some guys here who are smart, tough, dependable, to kind of take the Giants quote there. Get in these guys that aren't going to be on the sidelines for half the season injured or causing any stirs in the media. You got to get into these guys that are going to be available. I think that's going to be the number one priority for both the Jets and the Giants, is making sure that these acquisitions this offseason, that they count for something and that they're available and healthy throughout the year. Absolutely.
I love it. Fun episode 1 going through free agency. We'll be back again on Thursday to go through some more topics. Really excited to build this thing with you, Anthony, going through a little Jets, Giants, batting around free agency. We'll have the topics ready to go for Thursday. But before we go, where can people find your stuff over on the Giants?
Yep. Find my Twitter account at Anthony_Rivardo. Find me on Fireside Giants on YouTube. On all platforms, you can find Fireside Giants, and my own personal channel, Anthony Rivardo NFL on YouTube. You can find me there breaking down a little bit of the draft, and that's pretty much it. I'm excited to continue this, Matt.
Absolutely. So that I am at Matt O'Leary NY on Twitter or X, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok, anywhere. We're talking Jets, and now talking Jets Giants over here on Big Apple Blitz. That'll do it for us for episode 1. Thank you so much for tuning in. Please make sure to subscribe before you go. Leave a like, comment, share with a friend. That'll do it. I'm Matt. He's Anthony, and we'll catch you next time.